December 15, 1993. Battle Creek, Michigan. A winter evening so still, it could have been painted, if Norman Rockwell had ever dared to capture the moments right before tragedy. Snow was falling in heavy, lazy flakes, each one glowing amber under the streetlights. The air was hushed, almost unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that doesn't just surround you, it sinks into your thoughts, muffling even the sound of your own heartbeat. The temperature had plunged to 14 degrees, and the wind cut sharp, biting at the skin like shards of glass. Every breath carried frost, curling white in the darkness. From the modest two-story home on Riverside Drive, the front door creaked open. Hillary Evans stepped outside, tugging her navy blue parka closer against the cold. She was just 20 years old, but carried with her the kind of beauty small towns quietly nurture, effortless, unself-conscious, and genuine. Auburn hair shimmered like copper when caught in the light. Her green eyes crinkled when she laughed, always pulling others into her joy. Her smile had the kind of warmth that could disarm anyone, so much so that the elderly clerk at Morrison's Hardware often said it reminded him of the moment, decades ago, when he first fell in love with his wife. Tonight, though, that smile was hidden behind a thick wool scarf, hand-knitted by her grandmother. A scarf wrapped not just in yarn, but in love, history, and little lessons passed down through generations. Lessons like, borrowed books must always be returned, kindness must never be withheld, and weather, no matter how brutal, should never be an excuse to neglect one's promises. As Hillary walked into the snowy quiet, the street stretched ahead like a blank page. A simple errand, a simple night, or at least that's how it should have been. What she didn't know was that this ordinary winter evening would mark the beginning of a story the town would never forget. The book tucked beneath her arm was no ordinary choice. It was To Kill a Mockingbird, borrowed from her closest friend, Sarah Walsh, who lived exactly 3 blocks away on Elm Street. It was 2 days overdue, and though no one else cared, Hillary's conscience would not allow her to rest until it was returned. At the kitchen table, her mother Margaret had shaken her head when Hillary mentioned her plan. The radio had been warning all evening about what they were calling the worst December storm in 5 years. "Honey, that book can wait until morning," Margaret said without glancing up, pencil tapping against the crossword puzzle she worked at precisely 8:30 every evening. Routine was her anchor. But Hillary's resolve was stronger than routine. She was already pulling on her boots, those brown leather ones she had saved for 3 long months to buy. Their thick rubber soles squeaked against the linoleum as she tightened the laces with determined fingers. Her father, Robert, had looked up from behind the crinkling folds of the Battle Creek Enquirer, still damp with snow from his trip to the mailbox. His voice was gentle but laced with concern. "Be careful out there, kiddo. Visibility's terrible. Take the flashlight from the drawer." The small mag light felt heavy and reassuring in her coat pocket as she stepped onto the porch. Outside, the world had been reduced to shades of white and gray, punctuated only by the occasional yellow glow of a neighbor's window. Snow had been falling steadily since mid-afternoon, layering the town beneath nearly 8 inches of icy silence. Her boots sank into the powder with that crisp, unmistakable crunch that only fresh snow makes, a sound that seemed impossibly loud against the otherwise empty night. Riverside Drive stretched ahead like a corridor carved through winter itself. Familiar homes had been stripped of their individuality and transformed into strange, ghostly silhouettes. Mrs. Kowalski's line of garden gnomes had become nothing more than hunched, faceless lumps scattered across the lawn. The Hendersons' neat picket fence had disappeared beneath soft mounds, its form reduced to uneven shadows. The town Hillary knew felt distant, consumed by the storm. Beautiful, yes, but also eerily foreign. Her path was muscle memory, down Riverside to 3rd Street, left to Maple, and then right to the Walsh's yellow house with its wraparound porch. On any other night it was a 15-minute stroll. Tonight, 20 minutes would be optimistic. The snow was heavier now, thick flakes stinging her eyes as though they had chosen her face alone as their target. She tugged her knit cap lower over her forehead, but it did little to keep the sting away. At the corner of Riverside and 3rd, she stopped beneath a street lamp. The wind had grown crueler, swirling the snow into tiny whirlwinds that danced in the amber light like ghostly ballerinas. Her breath came in quick puffs of white, vanishing instantly into the storm. She clicked on the mag light, but the beam barely reached beyond a few feet of sidewalk. It didn't matter, she knew this route by heart. 3 more blocks. On 3rd Street, the houses blurred together, their unique faces erased by the storm's relentless brush. Porch lights glowed like islands of safety, but between them stretched vast stretches of blackness, thick with snow and uncertainty. Each dark gap seemed to hold its own silence, heavier, watchful. Her feet, wrapped in thick socks, were beginning to numb inside her boots. She lengthened her stride, eager for the familiar warmth of Sarah's kitchen, where Mrs. Walsh always greeted her with fussing affection and a steaming mug of hot chocolate. Hilary could already picture her shaking her head, half in disbelief, half in admiration. "In this weather, dear? You must be out of your mind." But what Hilary didn't know, what no one could have guessed, was that before she reached that yellow house on Elm Street, something else would find her in the storm. It was 9:07 p.m. on December 15th when Hilary Evans turned left onto Maple Street. She knew the exact time because she'd glanced at her Timex wristwatch under the amber halo of a streetlight, the same watch her parents had gifted her at high school graduation. Her boots crunched in steady rhythm against the untouched snow, each step sounding louder than it should have in the storm's eerie quiet. As she passed the Mitchell house, warm light glowed behind frosted windows. A thin line of smoke rose from the chimney, curling into the white sky before dissolving into the blizzard. Out front, Gary Mitchell was bent over his walkway, shoveling with a determination that seemed almost pointless. Every path he cleared was quickly reclaimed by the storm. Still, when he spotted Hilary, he straightened, lifting one gloved hand in greeting. "Evening, Hilary," he called, voice muffled by the howling wind. "Terrible night to be out walking." Hilary raised the paperback briefly in explanation, her scarf slipping slightly as she spoke. "Just returning a book," she shouted back. "Can't sleep with it overdue." Mitchell chuckled, shaking his head. The sound carried strangely in the muffled air, as though the storm itself swallowed it. "Your grandmother raised you right. Be careful out there." She waved, adjusted the book under her arm and kept moving. Her footprints joined the few other marks in the snow, mostly fading tire tracks from cars that had braved the streets earlier in the evening before conditions grew treacherous. Ahead, through the curtain of white, the Walsh house waited. Its familiar yellow siding was barely visible, but Hilary never reached it. Somewhere between the Mitchell's front yard and Sarah Walsh's wraparound porch, on that 3-block walk she had made hundreds of times before, Hilary Evans simply vanished. The storm swallowed her whole. Snow continued falling, patient and relentless, erasing her footprints one by one, as if she had never existed. Dawn broke over Battle Creek, December 16th. The world outside was transformed, 18 fresh inches of snow gleaming under a pewter sky. There is a peculiar brightness that follows such storms, as if the entire town had been placed under glass. Inside the Evans' modest home, Margaret had slept little, waking again and again through the night. She listened for the front door, for the creak of the stairs, for the soft sound of Hilary's boots being kicked off in the hallway. Nothing came. At 6 a.m. she gave up on sleep entirely. Padding into the kitchen in her slippers, she clung to the rational explanation. Hilary had stayed at Sarah's house overnight rather than risk the walk home. It was a comfort until Margaret poured coffee and stood at the window, staring at a landscape buried in snow. That's when a cold certainty began to settle deep in her chest. Hilary would have called. No matter how bad the weather, no matter how late the hour, she would have let them know she was safe. It was who she was. With deliberate steps, Margaret climbed the stairs. Each creak of the floorboards carried the fragile hope that she was wrong, that her daughter was asleep behind a closed door. She knocked softly, then pushed it open. Hilary's bed was untouched. The comforter pulled tight. The pillows arranged neatly. The air in the room held that stillness only found in true absence. The scream that escaped Margaret was primal, a sound torn from the very foundation of motherhood. Robert came running within seconds, his face shifting from confusion to dread in an instant. Together they stood frozen in the doorway, unwilling to cross the threshold. As if stepping inside would make the disappearance undeniable. By 7 a.m., Robert was on the phone with the Battle Creek police. His voice was steady, but his hands shook so badly he had to cradle the receiver in both palms. The desk sergeant, calm and measured, explained what they always did in such cases. Most missing adults turned up within 24 hours. Maybe Hilary had simply stayed at a friend's house, maybe she had been delayed. But Margaret's instincts screamed otherwise. She dialed Sarah Walsh's number with trembling hands. Sarah's sleepy voice confirmed what Margaret already knew. Hilary had never arrived. Sarah had waited until nearly 10 p.m. before giving up and assuming the storm had changed her plans. At 8:30 a.m., Sheriff Tom Brennan stepped through the Evans' front door, snow clinging to his heavy coat. At 52, Brennan had served as sheriff for 11 years in a town where real crime was rare. His deputies were more accustomed to mediating fence disputes or tracking down runaway teenagers than leading searches for missing persons. 2 deputies were already tied up with weather emergencies: a fallen tree across Highway 37, cars spun into ditches, an elderly man's furnace that had failed overnight. Brennan had little manpower left. And yet, he now faced a case that demanded everything he had. By 10 a.m. word had spread. In small towns, news traveled faster than police reports. Neighbors began arriving at the Evans home, carrying thermoses of coffee, offering food, asking what they could do. It was the same spirit that had carried them through the flood of '89 and the tornado scare of '91. Gary Mitchell was among the first volunteers, his weathered face carved with worry. "I saw her last night," he told Brennan, voice heavy with guilt. "Around 9. She waved, said she was returning a book. I told her to be careful." His wife Linda confirmed the timeline. "We were watching the storm reports. Gary went out to shovel, came back and saying he couldn't believe anyone was out walking." Search parties began forming almost organically, dividing Battle Creek into grids with the kind of precision only a community bound by crisis can manage. Groups of 5 and 6 trudged through snowdrifts, calling Hillary's name into the muffled air, checking every shed, every alley, every patch of woods. But the snow was merciless. It erased as quickly as it revealed. At Maple and 3rd, investigators found the last distinct impressions of Hillary's boots, clear, deliberate. Beyond that, the trail vanished into churned snow and ice, as though she had stepped off the face of the earth. By the time daylight began fading, the Evans living room was filled with neighbors, strangers, volunteers, all united in hope. But with each returning searcher, exhausted and empty-handed, hope began to fracture. The arithmetic of fear had begun. What had started as a simple walk on a snowy night was now unraveling into the beginning of a mystery that would haunt Battle Creek for decades. Sheriff Brennan faced a reality that bordered on desperation. Battle Creek's police force was modest on its best day. 2 patrol cars, one of which coughed and stalled every time it hit second gear. A radio system that fizzled into static whenever thunderstorms rolled through Calhoun County. A small evidence room in the basement that smelled of mildew. Against the resources needed to properly investigate a disappearance, it all felt almost quaint, an echo of another era woefully out of step with the task at hand. Deputy Marcus Chen was the department's youngest member, and perhaps its most restless. At 28, he had left Grand Rapids 3 years earlier, convinced that a small town would offer less chaos and more meaningful work. He had a hunger for procedure, for detail, for the kind of methodical police work he had only read about in textbooks. Brennan admired that drive, though sometimes it exhausted him. On the morning of December 16th, Chen had already spent hours with the department's single digital camera, crouched in the snow to capture every angle of Maple Street. He documented tire tracks half erased by wind, boot prints leading toward nothing, and the general layout of a street now etched into his mind forever. His report to Brennan was grim. "The trail ends here," he said, pointing toward a churn of frozen slush about 15 feet beyond the Mitchell house. "We can confirm her prints up to this point. After that, nothing. The storm erased everything. Even if someone carried her, we'd never separate those tracks from the ones the volunteers left last night." The weight of those words settled like frost. Brennan knew Chen was right. Across town, Deputy Angela Foster had taken the slower, more human approach. A Battle Creek native with deep roots and sharp instincts, she moved house to house with quiet patience, knocking on doors, sitting in living rooms, coaxing fragments of memory from neighbors. She knew small details often cracked open big cases. But on that night, those details were absent. 18 households later, her notebook was filled with the same refrain: "We were inside. We didn't see anything. The storm was too bad." By day's end, Brennan's team had exhausted their local capabilities. Their forensic reach stretched only as far as basic photography, fingerprint powder, and the ability to bag evidence for shipment to Lansing State Lab, a facility already drowning in backlog from larger cities with louder voices. Brennan made the call anyway. December 17, 9:14 a.m., he requested state assistance. He used careful language, a missing person case that might involve foul play. The answer came swiftly and predictably. Without a body, without blood, without an eyewitness pointing toward violence, the state police could not divert resources. Missing adult cases were local business, unless evidence suggested kidnapping or homicide. Battle Creek was on its own. Inside the Evans home, investigators searched Hillary's room with Margaret's tearful permission. The bed remained neat, untouched. Her desk held a diary full of the things any teenager might have written. Notes about college applications, worries about grades, and mentions of her part-time job at the drugstore. There were no confessions, no cryptic hints, no secret plans. Her bank account was clean. Her friendship stable. She was, by every measure, a young woman with roots in her community and goals for her future. The evidence room began to fill with items, mundane pieces of her life stripped of context and sealed in plastic. But none of it brought them closer to an answer. Search efforts expanded outward. Calhoun County deputies combed abandoned barns and snow-choked fields. Volunteers with the Michigan Department of Natural Resources traced the icy banks of the Kalamazoo River, dragging poles through brush and checking for thin ice. Churches organized food drives to keep search parties fed. Each day ended with exhaustion, empty hands, and a sharper edge of fear. Meanwhile, the town's imagination filled the void. Rumors multiplied. Mrs. Henderson swore she heard a car backfire around 9:30 p.m., though she later admitted it might have been her neighbor's furnace. Tom Walsh insisted he saw tire tracks he didn't recognize, only to learn they belonged to a pizza delivery boy. A teenage boy claimed to see a dark figure near the cemetery, but his parents revealed he'd been grounded in his room since dinner. Theories evaporated under scrutiny as quickly as they appeared. The toll on the department was brutal. Chen worked 16-hour days, running down every half lead with the certainty that the breakthrough was just one more question away. Foster stopped sleeping, lying awake at night replaying witness conversations in her head, wondering what she had missed. Brennan himself began to age visibly, new lines forming around his eyes, his shoulders sagging under the weight of expectation. The Battle Creek Inquirer ran daily stories, at first filled with appeals for hope, later with grim reminders that the case remained unsolved. By January, the tone shifted entirely. Hillary Evans' disappearance was no longer breaking news, but a haunting silence in the background of community life. The state never called back. The case that had once consumed every waking moment began its slow, inevitable transition into the cold case files. January 1994. Brennan and Chen sat in the living room of Gary and Linda Mitchell for the third time. The room reflected the ordinary clutter of a family who had built a life but never quite finished settling in. A wedding photo from 1978 shared shelf space with Little League trophies. Ceramic angels lined the mantel. Christmas garlands still hung from the windows, though their cheer had faded with the season. Gary, pale with guilt, set down a fresh pot of coffee. Linda busied herself with cups, avoiding eye contact. Their television, the one that had provided their alibi, sat dark in the corner, its screen reflecting the dim winter light. The sheriff took a breath before beginning again. "Let's go over that night one more time." The words carried the weary cadence of a man chasing a ghost. Gary Mitchell carried himself like a man permanently burdened by regret. At 44, his posture bore the telltale stoop of years spent bending over industrial equipment. His hands, though scrubbed daily, remained etched with grease that no soap could fully erase. Winters had chiseled his face into sharp lines, the squint of someone who had spent decades outdoors in Michigan's unforgiving cold. Sitting at his kitchen table, Gary poured coffee into mismatched mugs. His voice trembled with something heavier than nerves. "I keep thinking about that night," he confessed. "If I'd walked her over to the Walsh place, if I'd told her to wait until morning, if I'd just done something different." He stared down into the steaming surface of his cup as if the answers might rise there, bitter and black. You replay it over and over, wondering what you should have done. From the laundry room, Linda Mitchell emerged with a basket of folded clothes. At 41, she carried the exhaustion of disrupted sleep in her every movement. She worked part-time in the elementary school cafeteria, managed the house the rest of the day, and now shouldered the unbearable strain of being questioned again and again. Sitting beside her husband, she answered with the precision of someone who had repeated the memory until it no longer felt like her own. "We were watching Channel 8 News," she said. "They were running storm updates every 20 minutes. The weather service had warnings about the roads, showing crashes on I-94. That's why Gary was surprised. Anyone walking out there in that storm seemed wrong." Sheriff Brennan had listened to enough witnesses in his career to hear the difference between rehearsed answers and genuine recollections. The Mitchells' story had remained solid across every retelling. Their timeline matched programming logs. Their tone carried nothing more sinister than the concern of neighbors caught in a crisis. And yet, something nagged at him. Something he couldn't dismiss, even if he couldn't name it. Deputy Chin leaned forward, his notebook open, pen ready. He lived for timelines, for the belief that somewhere inside the tangle of small details lay the key. "Let's go through it once more," he said. "You saw Hillary walk past around 9? Gary nodded, tapping his fingers against the ceramic mug. I was shoveling. Dumb thing to do in weather like that, but the snow was piling up fast. Figured I'd better try keeping ahead of it. Truth is, Linda had been on me all week to fix the porch light, and I thought shoveling would give me an excuse to dodge that job one more day. The porch light was out? Chin asked. Burned out bulb, Linda cut in. Since Thanksgiving. We had to use the flashlight if we wanted to see anything after dark. So you were out there shoveling by flashlight when you saw her? Flashlight and the street light, Gary corrected. There's one on the corner. Gives decent light, unless the snow's heavy. I saw her coming down 3rd. Knew it was her by the way she walked. Hillary had this stride, purposeful but graceful. You notice things like that in a town this size. Brennan studied the man's face as he spoke. Every investigator learned the art of watching, measuring, questioning without words. Was this guilt? Or simply the ache of being too close to tragedy? In small towns, even the ordinary could become suspicious under the weight of the unexplained. The sheriff knew one truth about memory: it bent and shifted with time, yet certain details clung like frost. And in cases like this, those stubborn fragments, the little things nobody thought important, often mattered most. Witness testimony is a fragile thing. In the crucible of repeated questioning, memories bend, blur, and sometimes break. What people are certain they saw on a winter night can years later unravel beneath the pressure of evidence. The Mitchells' account was detailed, consistent, and ordinary. And yet, as every investigator knew, the ordinary could be deceptive. On December 15, 1993, Gary Mitchell stood outside his house on 3rd Street, shovel in hand, when he called out into the swirling snow. Evening, Hillary. She stopped briefly. She mentioned a book, a borrowed one she was determined to return, even on the worst night of the year. She laughed about her grandmother's lessons. Never keep what doesn't belong to you. Then she waved and walked on toward Maple Street. 30 seconds. Maybe 45. That was all. Just long enough for words to be exchanged, for two lives to brush against each other before separating forever. Gary went inside, boots dripping onto the mat, muttering about the cold. On the television, the Channel 8 meteorologist explained why the storm was far worse than forecast. The timeline fit, down to the minute. And yet, Hillary Evans never came home. For investigators, it was a scene etched in ice. A small-town couple, a neighbor girl, and a snowstorm that swallowed her path. The Mitchells' kitchen table became a stage for endless retellings. Gary's furrowed brow, Linda's hand resting on his, the news broadcast flickering in the background. All the elements of domestic normalcy, except for the fact that Hillary was never seen again. Deputy Chin noted every detail, even the television programming, because in small towns, broadcast schedules could be the only independent proof of time. Sheriff Brennan listened, weighing truth against instinct. The Mitchells were cooperative, patient, consistent. And yet, as he left their home that night, he carried the frustration of a lawman who could not push past the limits of memory. Spring arrived slowly in Battle Creek, Michigan. Snow retreated, inch by inch, uncovering the earth that had been buried since December. For some, the thaw meant relief. For investigators, it meant dread, because melting snow reveals secrets. Evidence. Or remains. Sheriff Brennan watched as search teams fanned through backyards and alleys, their metal detectors clicking over sodden ground. They found nothing. 4 months of searching had produced only absence, torn fabric that proved irrelevant, footprints that led nowhere, and lab reports that cataloged emptiness. No blood. No tissue. No foreign fibers. Nothing. Forensic pathologist Dr. Patricia Hayes, called down from Lansing, reviewed the case. Her conclusion was devastating. Without a body. Without a crime scene. Without witnesses to a crime. This case exists in a forensic vacuum. Cases like this, she warned, demanded either extraordinary luck or extraordinary patience. The Evans family was left in purgatory. Margaret, hollow-eyed from weight loss and sleepless nights, became a fixture at the police station, showing up twice a week, listening to the same updates delivered in the same careful tone. Robert buried himself in work at the Kellogg plant, isolating himself from everyone who reminded him of his failure to protect his daughter. Their marriage narrowed into survival, two people bound not by hope but by grief. By May 1994, the investigation was, in truth, over. Officially, the case remained open. Unofficially, it was drifting into that shadow realm known as a cold case. The box was sealed, labeled, and shelved. Box 94-12. A cardboard coffin for a mystery no one could close. Over the years, Battle Creek moved on the way towns do. Posters yellowed and curled. School board flyers covered them. The annual festival went on as it always had. Hillary's absence became part of the landscape, unspoken but omnipresent. Deputy Chin stayed with the file, promoted but still haunted. He kept a folder in his desk labeled Evans H. Follow-up. Entries grew rare, but he refused to let it die completely. Sheriff Brennan attended seminars on cold case management, listening to lectures about DNA databases and computer systems his department couldn't afford. Hope shifted from action to technology, from manpower to the faint possibility that someday science would deliver answers. The Evans family lived in suspended time. Hillary's bedroom was preserved exactly as it had been. Her belongings arranged not like relics, but like a room awaiting its occupant. For Margaret and Robert, memory had become ritual. For the town, her story had become folklore, something whispered to newcomers, avoided by those who had lived it. And for Gary Mitchell, the neighbor, the witness, the man who had spoken with her for less than a minute, life went on. He fixed the porch light. He landscaped the yard. He earned a promotion. But in the quiet moments, he carried the unshakable weight of being the last person to see Hillary Evans alive, before she vanished into the snow. By the late 1990s, technology was changing the rules of investigation. Forensic science was no longer just the stuff of science fiction. DNA analysis, once an experimental tool, had become the gold standard in solving crimes. But there was a catch. Small-town departments like Battle Creek simply didn't have the money or resources to run expensive DNA tests on old evidence. Every request had to be justified, and without solid leads, cases like Hillary Evans remained locked in storage, waiting for a reason to be reopened. Computers were now linking police agencies across the country, creating powerful national databases. In theory, a single sample of DNA or a fingerprint could connect crimes from coast to coast. But in practice, most small departments didn't have the training or equipment to access these systems. And so Hillary's case, like so many others, slipped further into the shadows. Her mother, Margaret Evans, refused to let her daughter's disappearance fade. She became the engine keeping Hillary's case alive, writing letters, speaking with reporters, pressing victims' rights groups, and reminding law enforcement that her daughter was more than a name in a file. Every year, she mailed a formal request to the Michigan State Police, asking if new technologies might finally bring answers. Every year, the replies came back the same: sympathetic, professional, but always concluding with the same words: limited resources, higher priority cases. Time was turning memory into history. By the summer of 1999, the file known as Box 94-12 was gathering dust in evidence storage. Children who were in elementary school when Hillary vanished were now teenagers, and adults who had once searched the snowy streets for her face could no longer recall details clearly. Hillary's disappearance had become less a living tragedy and more a story, something locals mentioned in the same breath as the 1965 tornado or the factory fire of 1982. A piece of folklore. But then came the 21st century, and with it, change. June 2018. Detective Sarah Coleman walked into the Battle Creek Police Department carrying a master's degree in forensic science and 5 years of cold case experience. At just 32, she was part of a new generation of investigators, trained in patience, fluent in technology, and unafraid to revisit the cases others had abandoned. She was Battle Creek's first dedicated cold case detective, funded by a federal grant designed to give small towns one last chance at justice. The department had been modestly upgraded since the 90s. New computers, secure databases, climate-controlled evidence storage. For the first time in decades, the dusty box labeled 94-12 was pulled from the shelf. On her third day, Detective Coleman laid its contents across her desk. Evidence bags filled with clothing fibers, hair samples, and soil specimens sealed by Deputy Chin nearly 25 years earlier. To investigators in 1993, these items had been dead ends. But now, DNA extraction technology had evolved. Samples once thought useless could suddenly tell stories written in genetic code. Coleman spent her first week buried in reports, photographs, and timelines. The details of Hillary Evans' final night came flooding back. The borrowed book, the walk to her friend's house, the 3 short blocks swallowed by snow and silence. Margaret Evans, now 72, continued her twice-weekly visits to the station. Her once youthful face had softened into dignified fragility, her gray hair carefully kept. When Coleman met with her, Margaret's voice trembled with cautious optimism. "I never thought I'd live long enough to see technology catch up to what happened to Hillary. But I've read about cold cases being solved with DNA. Is it possible that something in those boxes might finally tell us the truth?" Coleman didn't sugarcoat it. DNA was powerful, yes, but only if traces survived. Only if the person responsible had been entered into the system. Only if luck was finally on their side. Weeks turned into months. Samples were shipped to Lansing for testing. Margaret waited. Battle Creek waited. And then, one Tuesday afternoon in November 2018, the call came. Dr. Jennifer Morrison, a forensic analyst at the state lab, reported what no one had dared to hope. A full male DNA profile had been successfully extracted from fibers on Hillary's winter coat. After 25 years, there was now physical evidence tying an unknown individual to her disappearance. The profile was clean, complete, and ready for entry into CODIS, the national DNA database. If the person responsible had ever been arrested, if their genetic fingerprint was in the system, then the truth might finally emerge. 2 weeks later, on December 14, 2018, exactly 25 years and 1 day after Hillary vanished, the database returned a MASH. The name on the screen stunned Detective Coleman. Gary Mitchell. A neighbor. A family friend. One of the very men who had led the search for Hillary Evans in the snow that night. A man who had comforted her grieving parents, and who for 25 years had lived as a respected member of the community. The DNA evidence didn't just rewrite the case, it shattered the very foundation of trust in Battle Creek. The arrest of Gary Mitchell marked a turning point. For 25 years, he had worn the mask of a helpful neighbor, the man who shoveled snow, lent tools, and joined search parties. But DNA had stripped away the disguise. Science had spoken with a certainty that no human testimony could match. Yet, as Detective Sarah Coleman knew, DNA alone could not tell a story. It could prove Gary's presence. It could place him in contact with Hillary Evans on that bitter December night. But it could not explain intent, nor motive, nor the chain of choices that had turned a teenager's walk through the snow into a tragedy. At 6 a.m. on December 19, 2018, Gary Mitchell opened his front door for the morning newspaper. The same porch he had once stood on with a shovel, watching the snow swallow Hillary Evans a quarter-century earlier. This time, the snow crunched under the boots of Michigan State Police officers closing in. Coleman stepped forward as 2 uniforms secured the perimeter. Gary's expression shifted in seconds. Confusion, recognition, then resignation. He knew. The secret he had buried beneath silence and time had finally surfaced. Handcuffs clicked shut with the metallic weight that turns neighbors into suspects. Coleman read the Miranda warning, each word precise, each word stripping away the fragile protections he had relied on. For the first time in 25 years, Gary Mitchell was not a grieving neighbor. He was the accused. Inside the interview room, the stage was set. Digital cameras hummed quietly, documenting every gesture, every breath. Gary sat across from Detective Coleman, his shoulders heavy under the fluorescent glare. 25 years of secrecy etched deep lines into his face. Coleman began carefully, letting him retell his old story, how he'd seen Hillary walking, how they spoke briefly about a borrowed book, how he'd worried about her in the storm. The same account he had given in 1993. The same words he had repeated to investigators, to neighbors, to himself. Then Coleman shifted. "Gary," she said evenly, "we need to talk about DNA." The words landed like a hammer. She explained the tests, the advances, the sample pulled from Hillary's coat. She explained the match. His match. The one taken after his 2003 arrest for drunk driving. The change was instant. His mask cracked. His hands trembled. His breathing grew uneven. 25 years of careful deception collapsed under the weight of genetic proof. "I need you to explain," Coleman pressed, "how your DNA ended up on Hillary's clothing. There is no error. No contamination. This evidence is definitive." At first, Gary whispered. Then, slowly his voice strengthened. "She was so cold," he began. His eyes unfocused, his words dragging memories into the light. The snow was coming down hard. She was struggling. I offered her a ride. I told her she could wait out the storm at my place. Just warm up a little. His confession came in fragments, halting, broken by silence. He described convincing Hillary to step inside. He insisted he meant no harm. He claimed panic, not malice, had shaped what followed. "She wanted to leave," he said, his voice trembling. "We argued. I grabbed her arm. She pulled away, hit her head on the coffee table. When she stopped moving, when I realized she wasn't breathing." The words hung in the room, heavy and irreversible. A single moment, a fatal accident, or so he claimed, had redrawn the course of 2 lives. Hers ended, his consumed by secrecy. What followed was colder, more deliberate. He described lifting her body, driving out to the abandoned quarry, choosing water deep enough to swallow both the truth and his guilt. For 25 years it had worked. For 25 years the town of Battle Creek had believed in the illusion of the good neighbor. Now, under the unblinking eye of the camera, that illusion shattered. The snow swallowed everything. By morning even the tire tracks had vanished, as though Hillary Evans had never stepped into that December night at all. Inside the interrogation room, Gary Mitchell's confession dragged on for over an hour. He detailed how he'd hidden evidence, constructed an alibi, and perfected the mask of a helpful neighbor, while secretly carrying the darkest truth in Battle Creek. He had searched for the girl he killed. He had hugged the grieving family he destroyed. He had shared coffee with detectives who thought of him as a reliable witness instead of a murderer. For 25 long years, Mitchell lived inside this carefully built lie. Each day was a performance. Each smile, each friendly gesture, was part of a role meant to bury the memory of what he had done on that snowy evening in 1993. But in 2019 the curtain finally fell. Detective Coleman closed the interrogation, paperwork in hand. The DNA evidence, preserved for decades, had given science the strength to finally cut through Mitchell's web of deception. Yet it wasn't just the science that brought the truth forward. It was the collapse of a man who could no longer carry the weight of guilt pressing on his soul. On March 15, 2019, Margaret Evans sat quietly in the front pew of Calhoun County Courthouse. At 73, her face carried the lines of decades marked by grief. The courtroom itself seemed built for moments like this, its high ceilings and dark wood designed to remind everyone of the gravity of justice. This was the day her daughter's case would finally close. Mitchell had struck a plea deal, guilty to second-degree murder, 20 to 30 years behind bars. He claimed Hillary's death wasn't premeditated, that panic, not malice, had driven his actions. The deal meant Margaret was spared the agony of hearing every detail at trial, but it also meant she would never know the full truth of her daughter's final moments. Detective Coleman reviewed the files one last time. Decades of work, thousands of hours, dozens of officers, all leading here. Without the advancements of DNA science, Mitchell's secret would have rotted in silence, like footprints erased by snow. The people of Battle Creek reeled at the revelation. The helpful man they trusted for years was the monster in their midst. Neighbors who'd shared dinners with him, borrowed tools, waved across the street, now had to face the truth. Evil doesn't always come with warning signs. Sometimes it smiles back at you. Sarah Walsh, Hillary's best friend, returned for the sentencing. In her hand, she carried the copy of To Kill a Mockingbird Hillary had borrowed that night but never returned. For 25 years it sat on Sarah's shelf, its pages yellowed, but its meaning sharper than ever. A symbol of promises cut short. At 9 a.m., Judge Patricia Williams called the courtroom to order. Gary Mitchell shuffled forward in an orange jumpsuit. His face carried 4 months of jail time and 25 years of lies. His voice barely rose above a whisper. Your Honor, nothing I can say will bring Hillary back. I'm sorry for my actions, for the lies, for the grief. I've carried this weight for 25 years, and I'll carry it until I die. Then Margaret stood. Her victim impact statement was calm, measured, the voice of a woman who had practiced surviving pain. She spoke of the daughter stolen from her, of the years wasted in uncertainty, of Hillary's dreams for college and her joy in serving her community. Hillary would be 45 today, she said, her voice steady. But instead all we have is memory, and the knowledge that justice, though delayed, has finally been delivered. The courtroom fell silent. The snow had long since melted, but the shadow of that December night would remain forever etched in Battle Creek's memory. Despite her steady voice, Margaret's tears carried the weight of 25 years of grief that had finally found its place in a courtroom built to acknowledge loss. She spoke not only of the daughter she lost but of the woman Hillary might have become. A teacher. A wife. A mother. A friend to countless others. Gary Mitchell didn't just take my daughter's life, she said softly. He took all the lives she might have touched, all the love she might have shared, all the future she was meant to change. The sentence Judge Williams delivered reflected the uneasy balance between punishment and reality. Mitchell would serve a minimum of 20 years in prison, eligible for parole at 87. But whether he would ever walk free again depended on his conduct, and the voices of victims' rights advocates determined that his decades of deception never be forgotten. As the gavel struck and the courtroom emptied, a strange quiet settled over Battle Creek. Closure had finally arrived, but closure never feels simple. For some, it brought peace. For others, it opened a new kind of grief, the grief of knowing what was lost could never be restored. Detective Coleman closed the final file with a deep breath. This case had consumed thousands of hours, dozens of careers and spanned generations of investigators. And though resolution came too late for many, the lesson remained clear. Never give up on the truth. For Battle Creek, the story of Hillary Evans was both an ending and a beginning. The end of decades of uncertainty, and the beginning of healing, however fragile, after 25 years of silence. And as DNA technology continues to advance, this case stands as a message of hope for families still waiting, for answers, for justice, for peace. If you've followed this investigation to the end, then you know, it was never just about solving a crime. It's about remembering a life cut short and ensuring Hillary Evans' story, and others like hers, are never forgotten. So if stories like these matter to you, join our community. Subscribe to the channel, share your thoughts, and help us bring more of these voices into the light. Because justice delayed is still justice, and every victim deserves to be remembered.